you got the nutty professor today. We just have to make it best we can. I don't think I've got a rap song today, but we'll work on that next time. But last time that we were here, we talked a bit about apologetics and what that entails, and the main verse there was at 1 Peter 3:15 about being able to make a defense for what we believe. And we talked about that it's not just a defense, but also we look at proof and we look at offense in a way too, to oppose an attack of fallacious beliefs that are hurting people and harming them. So, we have multiple tasks before us, and we looked at the one of the aspects that is important is just coming to terms with the whole idea of truth, um, and that's under attack, of course, today, as we know. Um, with postmodernism, the whole idea that there is no truth, which is a contradiction that you can't have just asserted the truth. Anyway, that's kind of where we are in a culture that we have today. And we look at, in apologetics, we're trying to examine some of the most consequential questions of life. Do that, like where did I come from? Who am I? What is the purpose of life? Uh, how should I respond to evil, pain, and suffering? What's the answer to that? How should I behave myself? What will happen at my death? So those are some of the things that we looked at as the duty or goals and purposes of apologetics that we have to examine. And then we looked at like Paul did when he went to Athens and addressed the people there, and at Mars Hill, he obviously knew the culture. He knew what was going on. He knew what kind of philosophy they were into in their culture. And so it behooves us, if we're going to be good apologists, that we need to know something about what's going on in the culture. What are people thinking? What is it that is moving the culture? What kind of things that now? And we looked at some of those and trying to get an idea of what they are. We had this little graphic up here, but these are some of the narratives that are going on. And of course, right now, we see the New Age ideas have to do a lot of times with just uh, they talk about crystals and conscious expansion and all that kind of stuff, and then Christian Science where everything's an illusion. So anyway, there's a lot of these, but again, it's a small portion. So I think just kind of being aware of it. And the main thing there is just trying to go back to truth is where we need to point people. And then of course there's theism there, and in theism, these are some of the things that we have to look at to try to answer to people. Because what we would think of in a theistic view is that is self-existing, infinite, immaterial, spaceless, timeless, omnipotent, omnipresent, immutable, holy, personal. So those are some of the things that we're looking for. Then if we're on this search, we talked about last time the Christian investigator that we're trying to make these cases. We have to build something that's rational, and those are some of the things we face. Now, so one thing is to have a good idea when you're talking to and trying to present as an apologist is to have what is the basic biblical narrative. And, we have the creation story. And so the creation of the physical realm. And then there's the creation of non-human life. And then there's the creation of human life. And there's the fall of man, the flood, the remnant, like Israel, and then finally the Savior. And so that's sort of, and these are the things that we have to answer for if we're going to be good apologists. We have to make a case, make the case that these things are rational to believe. I thought this was interesting. I don't know how clear that's coming up, but this whole idea of Trinity is interesting in nature, that he's outlined here, that we have this triune universe because we have space, and we have this first dimension, but we really see everything in two dimensions. I mean, that's how we actually see things. Even an architect, you're going to draw it on two-dimensional, but you're picturing three-dimensional, because we experience that. It's where we actually experience space. And then there's time, which of course is three-dimensional as well. In a way, we have experienced the past, we're manifested now in the present, and we're, time is coming from the future. And then there's the three-dimensional aspect of matter, that it's generated through energy, the EMC squared, and then it's manifested in motion. Matter, we only appreciate matter as it's in motion, and then we experience it by various phenomena in life. So it's interesting how this Trinity, Godhead, is manifested in nature. That's sort of extra credit. That's not exactly what we're doing. So now we want to look just a little bit at we talked about what are some ways that we arrive at truth. We said last time there's, through philosophy, that's using our mind and reason, and then through science, looking at what's out here in the world about us, and then about history, which is a sort of an aspect of that we'll look at. And so they have these various arguments. Some of you may have heard of some of these, some of them not, that we can go through a little bit and see what we can learn there. So I'm trying to do a little differently. You'll be my experiment today, but I was told that it's not good to have too much writing on the screen. People can't think and hear at the same time reading it. So anyway, the cosmological argument. So the cosmological argument has to do with beginnings. And Aristotle, it's really interesting that some of these arguments, they really originate with the great Greek thinkers. So Aristotle, in his writing of physics, taught that there ultimately has to be an unmoved mover. There's no way that you cannot have eventually something that moved things to begin. At some point far back, there had to be something that was moving to make these things happen. So that was the cosmological argument is the unmoved mover. And then it's interesting how there's a version of that, though, that's been developed more. It's called the Kalam cosmological argument. It's a little bit different, and it was actually put forward by Al-Ghazali. I can't pronounce his name. Anyway, it was in 1058 when he was born, and he was a Sunni Muslim philosopher who lived in Tus, Iran. And he wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And in that, though, he stated that everything, he's actually a great Islamic philosopher, but anyway, that's the name of his book. And in that, he states that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and due to the impossibility of an infinite regress, the universe must have begun to exist, and therefore the universe must have a cause. And so the infinite regress is, again, a philosophical argument, is just the idea that you can't have an infinity that just keeps going back, or you would never arrive at today. That's the whole idea of the infinite regress. If you start a race, but it's never can get to the starting point because you're never getting to today, because infinity goes back forever. So how do you get to today? It's illogical, in other words. And so that's the whole idea of the infinite regress. And so since you can't have that, there ultimately had to be a cause since we're existing. And then Thomas Aquinas, who came along a little bit later, and he's born in 1224, he wrote a famous writing, Summa Theologica, which is a big tome that has all these things in it. But one of them is this argument, the cosmological argument, that anything, he did more from what's called contingency. That is that obviously we're contingent beings. In other words, we don't exist always. We know that already. And he's saying that everything we know in the world is contingent. Everything deteriorates, so it's obviously contingent. And so to have anything at all, there has to be something that's not contingent. In other words, a necessary entity or a necessary being in order to have these contingencies to be able to be maintained and brought forward. And so ultimately there's an uncaused causer, or an uncaused bringer of the contingent. So anyway, that's the cosmological argument. And then this has been developed more, and we'll look at that in science, because there's a whole area that deals with it from a science standpoint as opposed to philosophy. And then the teleological argument was the next one we had up there. And in that one, again, goes back to Greece. Xenophon in his book, Memorabilia, which he's citing Socrates. Socrates gave the connection that design in the natural world requires ultimately an intelligent cause. And that should seem natural to us as well. In the book of Romans, we already looked at that last time about how that from what is made, we can clearly see there has to be a maker. And yet we have to suppress that if we're going to go into the realm of naturalism. And so he was saying that design requires a designer, a cause of some sort, whatever you want to call that. And so that was from Greeks. And then Thomas Aquinas, who, again, we mentioned in his Summa Theologica, put forward a somewhat similar argument the same way, that design in the world requires a designer. And then, like Leonardo da Vinci in the 1400s said, this earth, it's all so perfectly designed, it's impossible that a single mind didn't create it, that there's no plan to it. And then there's a whole area of scientific stuff we want to look at that has to do with this whole idea of teleology. And so that will be another area we'll examine. But that's from the philosophical standpoint. And then there's the intuition, or the argument from intuition. And Augustine is the one that came up, at least wrote it anyhow, is the reason that since man was created in the image of God, this left intuitional consciousness in us that God exists in the mind of man, that there's there. In other words, this whole idea of why is it that all cultures, there's somebody, everybody is a concept of worshiping something greater. And it's just natural, even as Carl Sagan is telling us, something great, it's just, there's something greater. And that's that consciousness that God put into us, is what he was saying. And there's the intuition argument. He said, and then the scriptures in Ecclesiastes, this verse is interesting. I know there's a lot of different readings of it, but it's a common reading is that he has also set eternity into the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end. Ecclesiastes 3:11. So this whole idea that it's in our heart, he's put this in us, and yet we can't totally fathom God. He's too great, but we have this sense, like even Carl Sagan was saying, this sense in us. And then another verse, in a way, is in Romans 2, where again, in an indirect way, says, "For when the Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these not having the law are a law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them." So again, this is in our hearts and in our conscience. Now, somewhat related in a way is the philosophical argument called the moral argument. And this, again, speaks to that most often raised objection, as we mentioned, about the problem of evil and the problem of pain and suffering. And there's a universal sense that we all have that something's wrong with the world, something's not right. A recognition that there's injustice, there's brokenness, there's just things that are evil even. And even those that are naturalists sometimes find themselves just accidentally saying that it's evil, but you really can't say that if it's naturalistic, because there's no reason to be able to argue that. But because of this, this problem actually provides one of the strongest argument for the existence of God, because if there is no overarching lawgiver, then there really can be no moral basis to claim that there's anything that is truly wrong or evil. It just is. To say that something is wrong, we must have an objective standard by which to make that judgment. Otherwise, we are left with just each person's subjective opinion or preferences, is all it boils down to, is preferences and opinions. If you don't have, you can't measure the distance on this stand here with a ruler if you don't have a ruler. So there has to be some way, and that's where you come in, that there has to ultimately be a lawgiver that's giving us this sense that things are wrong. There must be a universal author of morality, since mankind has a universal concept of morality, of oughtness. Things aren't right. This ought to be this way instead of this way. So that feeling of oughtness is an argument, a moral argument, that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. However, objective moral do exist, and duties do exist, therefore God exists, is the basis of that argument in a syllogism. All right, and then the next is the language argument, and that is that we really don't know of, that we know of, that people can learn language unless they hear someone speaking to them. We learn language by someone passing on language to us. And so there ultimately had to be someone, a language giver. Is the argument posits here, is that, if we're having somebody learn to speak or communicate, there had to be an ultimate communicator for us to even know how to do that. And then the ontological argument is one that you have to put duct tape around your head, I guess, in a way, because it's so you explode. But I don't know. It's a little bit difficult. A lot of people don't think it has a lot of weight. But this Benedictine monk, Anselm, back in 1078, I guess, he eventually became the Archbishop of Canterbury. But he came up with this argument that God is the greatest conceivable being. That has to, if you're going to say there's God, it has to be the greatest conceivable being. And then what he's saying is that if that's the case, God must exist, because if he didn't exist, he would not be the greatest conceivable being. So that's sort of a circular argument to me. But it went on for a while. But finally, in the 20th century, another philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, had a different formulation of that that makes a little more sense, I think. But again, it's very philosophical, so it's not, a scientific theory. Like we say, we're looking at philosophy right now. But it says it's possible that there's a maximally great being that could exist. It's possible that such a being could exist. Okay, if a maximally excellent or great being exists, he would exist at least in some possible world. Okay, and then he says if such a being existed in some possible world, he would exist in every possible world. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, he exists in our present real world. If he exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists, and therefore God exists. So anyway, that's the ontological argument, for what it's worth. Now, the next one is, I think, is probably the strongest argument, is the transcendent argument. It gets back to somewhat I mentioned earlier, just from the very beginning. So the transcendent argument basically is that laws of logic and math, we mentioned it last time, are outside of the real world. I mean, they exist external to it. Certainly not, you can't prove it by science or anything, these things, and they stem instead from God's sovereign nature himself, that it's a reflection of the mind of God. These laws are immaterial, they're universal, and they're invariant, consistent with their origin in God, who is himself immaterial, omnipresent, and immutable. So the laws of logic and math are in that way. Obviously, they animate all of our physics, are spoken in the language of math. So the laws of logic and math are the correct standard for reasoning, as opposed to our own emotions and our lived experience, which is the way people want to reason today. The laws of logic and math are incompatible with a naturalistic worldview, in which, as I said earlier, humans are nothing more than carbon-based moist robots, just molecules of motion. That's totally foreign to the idea of being able to do math or logic. It makes no sense. How would you say, hey, I've got this computer for you here. Well, where'd you get it? I found it in a tornado that hit through a junkyard, and it was here, try it out. And, you want to fly on the space mission using this computer to help us get out. Well, no, of course we know that doesn't make any sense. So anyway, that kind of goes through the basic philosophical arguments there in a whirlwind tour, but for what they're worth. But philosophy using that, that was used a lot before there was even all the scientific stuff we have now. And a lot of it's very sound, and it has its basis in the Greek philosophers. So it goes a long way back, even before the time of Christ, as being rational. Now, and of course, we have all these other benefits, which, when Paul wrote those words about how the natural world really speaks of God, and David did too, which, I mean, we do have that sense of awe when we see it, even if we don't know anything about science. We have so much more now. Now, so we'll transition. I said last time, again, we have to do something to wake everybody up after a few minutes. So we'll go to my favorite movie here. Let me get it up. Take a quick movie break. All right. So I only believe in science. Um, I've always loved science. Uh, Joe and I had many science experiments growing up. At my little lab at my house, everybody would go into my lab and we would do different things, mostly with gunpowder that we created, but there were other things. But at any rate, um, but Bill Nye is really a naturalist, of course, and he's really gone off the deep end now. If you see his latest stuff, he's all into gender confusion. But at any rate, um, what he's really into is scientism, and that's what we want to talk about now for a minute, because science is something that everybody knows and says, well, it is great, and I love it. It's fun, but um, we have to be careful about scientism. So the verse here says, turn away from godless chatter and the opposing ideas of what is falsely called knowledge, which some have professed, and in so doing have wandered from the faith. Now, of course, knowledge is another way of saying science, and we base it again on the natural realm. And so there is a place for methodological naturalism, where when we're doing work in the lab, we don't expect something just a genie up here. So yeah, I mean that we expect that the laws to be followed, and so that's true. But scientism is different. And so, what is scientism? I'll leave this one up, even though y'all won't listen to me now. But uh, um, so, no statements are true unless they are proven scientifically. So that's one thing. But we can agree with a little bit of that. But to say that no statements are true, that again doesn't make sense, because we just said logic and math are outside of that kind of area. So you've already got a contradiction there. And then naturalism, the view that the hard sciences provide the only genuine knowledge and objective reality. And then ethics and theology are just subjective, like we said earlier. They're matters of opinion, private matters, preferences, and it leads to destruction of the moral compass and intrinsic value, because everything's just molecules in motion again. It's just matter. So what does it matter if it's just matter? And so non-naturalistic truth claims are associated with bigotry and intolerance, and we're seeing that more and more. So if you are falling outside of these parameters, then you can easily be squashed as, you're being bigoted or you're intolerant. Even now, it's intolerant and bigot to require logic a lot of times. That's not fair. That's being mean. That we have to use logic. And then the material benefits derived from scientific research has led to societal awe of science, which is true in many ways. And then there's a cult of personality a lot of times in reference, like a white coat or whatever. And we saw that a lot with all that went on with COVID. You've got the, quote, experts spouting off all these things. But remember what we said, there's a fallacy of appeal to authority that's not a true appeal to authority. In other words, when there's controversy, when there's not anything that's settled, then you don't, appealing to authority has no more value than the other, because there's different opinions, because it's not settled. It's still being researched. And then there's the development, though, in scientism of a religious fervor to it, such that you would persecute dissenters and heretics, those that are dissenting from the narrative of the scientistic narrative. Again, scientistic and scientism. That's what we're talking about here. Not just, things that you can see and know as actual scientific information that's been established. We're talking about scientism that becomes essentially a religion. Um, and so um, you have all kinds of things like the time Dr. Fauci said, "I am the science." Okay, he's actually personified in science now. So in other words, we have these kind of things happening. There's all kinds of those like that. There's the uh, this happens a lot in the academy, like all the universities. There's professors all the time. There was one I was listening to the other day. He was professor of astronomy at a university, and there's a professor though at the University of Chicago, Jerry Cohen, who is a biologist, but he makes it his duty to, if he hears anything on the whole web or anything about a professor saying something that's not naturalistic, he immediately goes to that university and says, "You've got a problem, and we're going to sue you if you keep this professor spouting off this stuff." And so this professor was talking about things. Again, he wasn't spouting any particular religion. He was just saying questions about what does these things mean from a could potentially be anything higher than what we got. But because of that, the university eventually said, he had to be disciplined for that, and that happens all the time. You've got to follow the party line, and so that's an example of scientism. This whole idea that you've got to do it this way, our way, or the highway. And so that's the problem with scientism that we're seeing, this religious fervor, persecution of those. So we've already seen some of this. Where does that happen? It places the Christian claims outside the plausibility structure of the society. And that's where we are now. Of course, generally the society as a whole, although a lot of people say I'm Christian or whatever, as a general rule, if there's any question about any kind of conflict of a scientist saying this or that, well then the scientific claims take precedent. Shifts in the realm of religion and ethics from knowledge to blind faith is what is felt like. It leads to increasing hostility toward Christianity. It removes the necessary foundations for morality. We've already looked at that. And it dominates the education establishment, the news media, and the governmental bureaucracy. And that's where we are. Scientism definitely is in control. All right. So some of the myths, I thought this was a good one that actually got presented at University of Maryland somehow. I don't know what happened to the poor professor that did it. He may be in the gulag, but at any rate. So let's think about settled science for a minute, especially from a medical standpoint. The bloodletting was noted to be an established medical practice for all these years. I'm going to not cut you off. That's not right. Don't do that, man. But so bloodletting was a medical practice all the way back to ancient Egypt, continued in Europe and the USA, surprisingly, all the way up into the early 20th century. I don't know if you knew that. But yeah, it did continue in some forms in some places. And certainly we know our president, Washington, essentially died of bloodletting. And so the thing about it is, William Harvey, who discovered all about the human circulation system, that was in the 1620s. And he was saying, hey, we probably need to keep our blood in there. It's circulating. So the theory was, before that came from ancient Greece. This is one of the ones where the ancient philosophers had wrong, but it went way back, is that, there were these humors, and the blood was one of those that you get too much of it, you're really going to get sick because it just builds up. And so you got to let some of it out. That's what you need to do, is let that blood out, and then you can get better. But he was saying, hey, it's actually, there's only a certain amount here. It's not expanding, and it's circulating, and we need to keep it. But nobody would listen. He was crazy for saying that. So they continued to bloodlet, continued to do this. People having fevers, you get a fever, oh boy, we're going to take a bunch of blood out. Oh, that's rough. So, and then thinking of it from, of course, the classic ones, we don't know about that, with NASA here, is Ptolemy, which he had his book back in 150 AD, and but then Copernicus, which was saying, basically it was geocentric, that everything circled around the Earth, all the planets, everything. It was a belief system. And then Copernicus and Galileo came along in the late 1500s, early 1600s, and wrote their books about Copernicus with Revolutions was his book, and Galileo Dialogues. And in those, they place that, it's actually not geocentric, guys. It's heliocentric, and we circle around the sun. And so they were persecuted for that, obviously. And then going back to medical, one I really like is Semmelweis. He was this Austrian OBGYN doctor, and this is in he came along with his theory in 1847. Again, think of the time, 1847. That's not that long ago. But he was saying that, hey, we probably should be washing our hands before we do surgery. And everybody's like, what? Are you a nut? And everybody, man, he was, actually, he eventually got put in a insane asylum. It's really sad. Nobody would listen to him. They all thought he was a kook. And even if he even published his work, because he ran Vienna General Hospital in the OB/GYN section, that the patients he just noticed that they were dying. Women were afraid to go there. They were like, "This is a death. You go in there, you have your baby, you're going to die." And sure enough, of course, they would get this child bed fever, they call it, and really high death rate. It was probably I don't remember the exact number, maybe up to 20% or more dying for sure, and many more sick as all get out. And so he's noticed, though, that if they washed their hands, it dropped down to less than 2%. He was like, "This is amazing." And so he published it, "This is great." And everybody's like, "No, this is terrible. You're awful." It didn't make any sense to them, and they wouldn't accept it. So that went on for a long time, and it did not get changed until finally Joseph Lister Hill, who was an English surgeon, continued to work on this a whole bunch, and he had a lot of pushback too, but finally it was accepted in the late 1880s that you really need to have hand washing, sterile technique to do surgery. So there you go. There's settled science for you. And we have this all the time. And I can tell you tons of stories about my personal experiences with other doctors about what we went through with COVID. There's just tons of stuff like this happens all the time. It's a contradiction to talk about settled science in so many ways. So we just have to be aware that science is not a god. It's not immutable, and it's not perfect. And so we need to be careful about scientism that creeps in. Now, so I like these phrases, and so Galileo said, "Who would dare assert that we know all there is to be known?" Okay, and then here's Karl Popper, who's a famous scientific philosopher of science. "Dissent and disagreement are crucial to the advancement of knowledge. Scientific theories can never be completely finally verified. They can only be falsified." And so if a scientist bristles at the idea that you may falsify his theory, well, that's a red flag, because if you can't be falsified, then it's not really something that we can understand. And then here's Stephen Hawking, who's no friend of Christianity, but he said, "Any physical theory is always provisional in the sense that it is only a hypothesis. You can never prove it. No matter how many times the results of experiments agree with some theory, you can never be sure that the next time the result will not contradict the theory. On the other hand, you can disprove a theory by finding even a single observation that disagrees with the predictions of the theory." So, am I supposed to stop now? We've got to go. Okay. So, we'll then end at that, and we'll pick up next time and continue to put this together. Thanks for your attention.